Hi chemistry class, I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I hope this video will be helpful. First, let's talk about the test corrections. Exam corrections are now due Monday, November 14th. Yes, it's true, so you have this class, next class, and the weekend to complete your exam corrections. In addition to that, we have a really fun lab for you to do today in next class called Analysis of 10 Unknowns. Notice that the lab sheet that you're going to get actually says 11 unknowns, but on this one I crossed it out and said 10. Took one of them out. What are these unknowns? Well, they all look very similar. They look like this, white powder. So it's very hard to tell one white powder from another. You can see that these two look very similar, all right? But they are labeled with letters A through K. This one happens to be powder D, and I don't know if you can see the D on there. There's a label on the front of each container and on the cap. Make sure that the proper cap stays with the proper container. So basically you're going to have 10 white powders and you're going to do all these chemical tests on them to try to identify the names of each of them. This is a qualitative lab as opposed to a quantitative lab, and the reason it's qualitative is because we're not measuring the outcome of it. We're just looking for color changes and bubbling and different types of qualitative observations to help us determine what these substances are. Now, the main supply that your lab group is going to need, and you can work in lab groups, I would say, of up to 4. If you really want a larger lab group, talk to your sub about that, and that's pending their approval. But each group is going to need 10 test tubes, and each of these test tubes is going to house one of those mystery powders. So there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, and K. J is the one I took out, so there's no J. Now, you can imagine that if you put all the 10 powders in these test tubes, we wouldn't be able to differentiate and do any exams because we wouldn't know which is A and which is B. So what we need to do is manually label these test tubes. So here's some masking tape, and all you would need to do is take a piece of it and write A on it and put that A right on here. So you want to label all of your test tubes and then match them to the powder and put a small amount of each powder. Now, how much? The lab actually isn't very specific, so this is a really important part of making the lab successful. I wanted to give you a visual and show you how much substance to put to use. Now, here is a scoop, and you can see there's white powder on there. Do you think this is too much, too little, or just right? Turns out this is too much. If you use too much powder in this lab, some of the reactions won't happen as planned. The proper amount, when we say a very small amount of powder, look at the difference between the amount of powder that's in here versus the amount of powder that's in there. It's just a tiny speckle of powder that's going on the tip there. Oop, that just went onto my pants, but okay. Again, because one of the tests that we're going to do is whether or not it's soluble, whether it dissolves in water, if you put too much powder in there, it's going to overwhelm the water and it's not going to dissolve. So you want to use a very small amount of powder. What do I do now? All right, I'm going to have to stop this. Sorry about that. That was Alex Hoover knocking on the door. Hi, Alex. But that worked out well because it gave me time to get my lab coat and safety goggles because I'm going to show you part of this lab. But before I do, I want to be very clear that safety comes first. You must wear lab goggles throughout this lab, and you must put on a lab coat throughout this lab. Alright, so let's say that we have our powder A, and then our powder is in there. The first thing that you're going to do with all of your powders is add water to it to test to see whether or not the powder dissolves in water. If it does, if it dissolves, that means it is soluble. If it does not dissolve, the term that describes it is insoluble. Of the 10 powders that you're going to test, 7 of them are soluble and 3 are not. You're going to follow this flow chart. See, under the word flow chart is that box, and it lists all the powders, and then below it you'll see a little line that says the word water. And that means you are quote unquote doing the water test and adding water to each tube. And that's going to differentiate the 10 powders into two groups, the soluble one and the insoluble one. This component of the lab is very critical, because if we don't get this, which ones are soluble and insoluble correct, it's going to have a trickle-down effect, and it's going to be hard to identify them later on. So I will give you a hint. First of all, no, I'm not going to give you a hint. I gave you the hint that 3 of them are insoluble, but I am emailing your sub to tell them which 3 letters are insoluble, and I would strongly suggest that after you perform the water test on all of the 10 unknowns, that you go to your teacher and tell them, I think it's this one, this one, this one that are insoluble. And the teacher will tell you whether you're right or wrong. And if it's not correct, go back and redo that test, because you want to make sure that you've correctly identified the 3 insolubles. Now, how would you do that? Well, where did I put that? Here. All right, so there's some powder in here. It's going to ask you to put 5 milliliters of water in here. So you would just take a small graduated cylinder, put 5 milliliters in it, and pour, and stir it around a little bit. There are some wooden stirring rods here included with the lab if you need them. It's a stirring rod, so you can use that to stir. What do you think about this one? Soluble or insoluble? It may be difficult for you to see on the camera, but all of the powder has disappeared, and therefore this one is soluble. Now, I should tell you, this is not A. I just labeled this A arbitrarily, so I haven't done A for you. You're going to have to do all of them. There we go. It's still an unknown. Okay. After you've determined which ones are soluble or insoluble, you basically just follow this flow chart, and you're going to have them in 2 groups, the ones that are soluble and the ones that are insoluble, and it'll tell you what the next test is to do. And you keep breaking them down further by doing tests until you identify them all. How do you record your data? Well, on this sheet here is the data table, and it'll ask you for your observations after each one, A, B, C, D. Notice that J is crossed out there. Every time you do a test and you notice something about C did this or C did that, write it down as an observation, and ultimately you should be able to identify all of them here. Oh, that's really cool. Look how the glasses match the rainbow behind me. Anyway, sorry. That's basically it. Be safe. Be safe. Wear your goggles. Wear your lab coat. Walk slowly. Please make sure that the caps stay with the proper container. Keep these containers on the lab cart. If someone takes this whole thing, and brings it over to their cart, no one else is going to be able to find it. So you're going to fill your test tubes at a central station. And then as far as all the other chemicals, there's phenolphthalein, vinegar, there's a bunch of them that you're going to use. It's going to ask you to use a dropper and put a certain number of drops in it. That's one of the tests. Another test is to take the test tube and heat it up. Oh, in the lab it says to use a Bunsen burner to heat up your test tubes. Because I am not there, we are making a safety modification, and we are not turning on the gas and using Bunsen burners. What you're going to use is a hot plate, and they are on the cart here. So what you would do is plug this in, and then get a beaker from the side of the room, I don't know, a 200 to 300 milliliter beaker, fill it halfway with water, get it boiling, and then put the test tube in there. And so it's like a double boiler. And if it asks you to heat up a test tube, that's the way to do it instead of using a Bunsen burner. You have 2 periods to complete this lab and hopefully correctly identify all of the 10 unknowns. Honestly, if you do, let's say you did 10-15 minutes of test corrections and then wanted to start the lab, and let's say the only thing that you got done on day 1 was to do the solubility test and identify the solubles versus the insolubles, that's fine. Then you can take all of the next period to do the rest of the tests. It takes a little bit more than 1 class period to complete this lab, so giving you 2 class periods should be just the right amount of time for you to A, complete this lab, B, work on test corrections so that you can have them for me on Monday when I see you in class. Okay, good luck. And miss you guys, and I'll see you on Monday. Thanks.